So, across the lifecycle of Arknights, 5-star operators have always had a negative reputation. Most people saying that they're too expensive to just casually build like a 4-star, but also not strong enough to justify the time it takes to actually build them like 6 stars. They're kind of in an awkward place because of this, right? Well, as someone who actually uses 5 stars, I very much disagree. So if you were to build a 5-star operator, let this video be a guide as to which ones are actually worth building. I do have to say, if you like any operator, build them. Don't let me or anyone saying that they're bad stop you. Any operator, no matter how bad, still has a place. I mean, man, I used an E1 level 1 Tsukinogi on my Underdawn clear. And this is just the difficult level content. Generally, Arknights is not hard enough to make you use the top meta picks. You can definitely get away with a squad with a few characters that you bring just cause you like them. And you might be thinking who the hell I am, and why I have a say to which 5 stars are better. Well, first of all, I have built and tested all the 5 stars in this video. And second of all, I am a 5-star Niche Knights player. Nowhere near as good as the people over at LD, for example, but I can assure you that I have the experience with this niche and the game in general to evaluate these operators. Again, I beat Underdawn with 5 stars only. Oh, and sorry to break it to you, but I clickbaited you. Rather than ranking from worst to best, what this video will really do is categorize the upcoming operators into 4 groups. The first will be the operators that I would not recommend anyone building. Second group would be the operators that I truly and honestly find mid. These are operators that I still wouldn't really recommend building unless you're participating in certain niches that I'll mention with the operator. Third group of operators are just ones that are incredibly solid. They will definitely serve you well if you take the time to build them. And the last category. They would be the top 3 characters to come out, and ones that I would recommend most people to build. By the way, none of the operators within these categories are tiered in any way, since it's incredibly hard to compare operators with different niches to each other. But I will mention if I think an operator is better or worse than the others in their category. But without further ado, we go to the first category, the true stinkers. Operators that I would never recommend anyone building. The first one of them being Sand Reckoner. Where do I even begin with this character? When first trying to think of what video to make, it was Sand Reckoner here and another operator we'll talk about way later on that made me want to make this video in particular, because it made me think about just how vast the usability of operators can be even within their own rarity. Okay, I'll talk about the good things first. He's a summoner. Literally already has value just because of that. He's the only 5-star summoner, in fact, that has ranged summons. He inflicts sluggish at a pretty consistent rate with his S2. This is probably the best part about him. And he and his summons all do arts damage. Okay, so why is Sand Reckoner in the never build section? Well, it's primarily because of his horrendous uptime. A 40-second SP cost for a 20-second uptime is insanely bad for what the skill actually provides. In comparison, Scene's S2, a much better skill, also has a 20-second uptime but has a 30-second downtime. And I promise you, Scene summons will do way more damage in stalling than Sand Reckoner can ever do. Even ignoring that, his DPS, even against mechanical enemies, is easily outclassed. And even if you say that his main deal is his ability to inflict sluggish, against ranged enemies, his summons just die incredibly fast since they have no form of sustain. Magellan has invis on her summons, and Ling's S2 just has incredible skill cycling that'll let her save her summons. Against big melee enemies that you would naturally want to stall out, like cars from Ideal City, well, if the summon is in a safe place, that means you can just as easily put a Diesel Binder there. Since Sand Reckoner turns his summons into glorified Diesel Binders for 20 seconds, why not just use a Diesel Binder that slows without skill activation, has an actual skill on top of that, will only use up 1 deployment limit, and will probably do more damage anyway. Guys, legitimately, if I'm missing something, please tell me, cause I have no idea. But is he the worst 5-star? Hell no. But at least in my opinion, no one should build this guy unless they really like him. Next on the list is Laios. An entire subgroup dedicated to your name, and you're easily the worst operator in it. But I do have to say that this kit, you know, it's not bad. I mean, look at it, those skills aren't half bad. That talent seems pretty damn good too. So, what's the problem with Linus? Why is he all the way down here in the never build section? Oh, but legitimately, imagine this kit on a Centurion, suddenly you have a really decent operator. But as it stands, his S1 basically just makes him a better version of Flamebringer's S2, which isn't saying much. It's like your teacher saying, "Hey, at least you're smarter than one of the dumbest kids in class." Yeah, gee, thanks a lot, way to boost my His S2 is alright. It's more for stall more than damage. It's sort of heli droppable. He fears all blocked enemies, which is a grand total of 1. See what I mean when I said he'd be better as almost every other guard subclass? Well, let's move on. Lucilla. I am so sorry that you have to be here in the bottom of the list. I love Lucilla. I think she's gorgeous, but her fragility only affecting basic enemies and not elites or bosses just makes her use cases too few and far between for me to consider putting her in any other part of the list. Don't get me wrong though, her slow and stacking fragility on her S2 is quite powerful, and she has a good enough uptime ratio. This lets her be a huge help on stages that has hordes of decently powered basic enemies. The Inferno stages for Chapter 9 really sends hordes of decently tanky enemies that get even tankier when they're close together. Chapter 10 has the enemies that spawn out of others that have lots of damage resistance. Chapter 13 has hordes of enemies that has high movement speed that Lucilla will help slow down and build her stacks at the same time. So yeah, there are specific scenarios where Lucilla would shine. Among the 3 in this tier, I do think she's the best one, but this won't make her escape the bottom of the list. Even operators worse than Lucilla can find use in the most difficult content. Like I said, I used an E1 level 1 Tsukinogi in my 5-star Underdog clear. You know, this is part of the reason why I enjoy this game so much. No matter how bad an operator is, they always find use if you just give them a try. But with that said, let's move on from the bottom of the list and go talk about operators that I actually wouldn't actively advise against building. The operators from this category are ones that I would consider as either decently good at their niche, important for certain niches, or mid. Speaking of mid, let's talk about the first character in this section. Papyrus is fine. Her talent gives allies that she heals a small shield. Most of the time, this effectively just lets her have a 20% better heal, which is quite sizable, don't get me wrong. And if the target is near full HP, this functions as an overheal. Her HPS is actually quite big on S2, and her S1 doubles her heal amount and shield amount at the same time. But therein lies the problem. Medics are in quite the weird spot right now, because they need to do something else than just heal to be viable. We already have the best operators readily available that heals a significant amount on permanent duration. Ea Alter, Quercus, and Lumen, who is a free operator. Medics that aren't those 3 need to do something else other than just heal. Telopsis with her SP regen talent, Nightingale trivializing arts damage, damage with incantation medics, or even just a simple attack buff from Warfarin. If you don't do anything special, you're just left with mostly nothing. Because even though your HPS is high, well, that really isn't unique to you. So Papyrus unfortunately lands in a pretty early part in the list. Figurino is the next operator on the list, and he's an interesting one for sure. His S1 is not very good. It's the same attack buff as Jay's S2, but with a worse effect. Sure, he definitely does more damage thanks to his talent, but I don't think I can justify building this over Jay. His S2 on the other hand is where he gets interesting. You can basically think of this as an upgraded Project Red S2. Sure, it binds instead of stuns, but for certain situations, bind might even be better since less enemies are immune to it. He does pretty decent amounts of damage with his skill, but it costs 25 DP. And that doesn't even account for the DP loss you'd naturally get from just placing down a merchant. But it's still a great stalling tool, it's heli droppable, it does decent damage and crowd controls for a decent amount of time. So if you can afford it, it's not really bad. The reason why he's so low on the list is it's because it's pretty hard to justify the cost even with a better effect. I like the idea, but that alone won't make him move up a tier. Next up, we have Techno. Techno is an operator that's alright. She's a new archetype that lets her summon little puppets whenever an enemy within her range dies. The puppets have a really low stats, but they do add to her DPS. Her S2 expands her range and lets all of her puppets have ranged attack, while doubling her puppets and her own ASPD. It's really not a lot of damage if I'm honest with you, and the uptime ratio is pretty bad too. But the sheer fact that she just replenishes these whenever an enemy dies in her range makes her actually a pretty flexible operator. Also, I quite like her S1. It increases the block count, HP, and defense of the puppets, while also on a good skill cycle. You can probably tell from my tone that we're getting to the point of the video where my opinion of these operators are starting to get more positive. Techno is a pretty solid operator. I do think for most people she would be quite redundant, but for certain niches like Arknights, Techno is huge. She's the first operator that has consistent form of block. Before this, you had to rely on Dusk Summons, or a Beeswax Totem. Not really the best method of blocking, so Techno would be your best bet in this department. Moving on, Mitum. The man in the middle. He really is a very solid operator. It helps that his subclass is pretty consistently good. Ignore him. Not many people value Tacticians since they're probably the worst Vanguard subclass in terms of generating DP, aside from, Chargers, which they exchange for their range and decent enough damage thanks to their trait. Though, once their summon dies, Tacticians are pretty useless, but this is exactly where Mitum shines in comparison, because once his summon dies, he spawns literal junk in the adjacent tiles to stall enemies, usually long enough for him to revive his summon. You can even retreat the summon to manually spawn the junk to have extra lines of defense. What ends up happening is that you have a Vanguard that almost always has a block count of 3. Being able to manually generate the trash while also having it as an emergency block makes Mitum quite versatile. And while yes, his DP generation is pretty bad, he'll be huge for a niche like Arknights, where your only other form of Vanguard is Vigna. Chilichuk waltzes his way all the way up here from the pure fact that he's an Agent Vanguard. His talent is pretty niche, but it lets you have aggressive placements in stages where there's environmental damage, whether that be Poison Haze, Nether Sea Brand, or Burning Reeds. Something to mention is that he does much less damage than Cantabile since he doesn't buff his attack at all. For clearing out trash mobs, horrible. For generating DP, that's what you want. His S1 is pretty much a meme, generating a random amount of DP averaging at 7 DP. It's a fairly high DP rate despite the RNG, but it's offensive recovery, so it suffers the same problem as Puzzle where you need to find something to wail on. Though I have to say that he activates his skill immediately as he gets deployed, sometimes completely refunding his DP cost immediately. His S2 isn't really anything special, it just generates a lot of DP in a short period of time. If you have the full Dungeon Meshi squad, his DP gen skyrockets to easily the highest DP gen in any 5-star operator. But at the same time, you'd be using up 4 full squad slots for that. Nothing much to say honestly. He's an agent, he's fast redeploy, DP on hit. If someone like Puzzle escapes from the bad operator label despite his questionable kit, Chilchuk definitely slides in this high on the list. The last operator in this tier, and the last operator from the Dungeon Meshi squad, Senshi, much like Chilichuk, slides in nicely this high on the list, mostly because of his subclass. Guardians are just a really solid class, and Senshi provides some of the biggest heals out of everyone. His S1 can't stack, nor does he exclusively heal low HP allies, but you can guarantee that he will be able to fully heal them regardless of what HP they're at because of his huge multipliers, while also granting them a random buff. It's not something I would rely on, but it's never a bad thing. He's also quite a bit tankier than other Guardians of this rarity because of his talent, increasing his own defense and healing effectiveness to himself. Of course, this gets even better with the full Dungeon Meshi squad. His S2 is a pretty generic Guardian skill, a big burst heal on a short cycle. Nothing really special, but that doesn't make it any less good than it is. For most cases, you can just think of Senshi as an upgraded Gummy. Nothing exceptional here, but like I said, never bad. Alright, now that we're done with the mid or niche operators, we move on to the operators that I would genuinely recommend anyone building. These are operators that either carve out their own niche or just quite useful in any scenario, or just occupy multiple roles at once and is actually good at them. The first operator that I'll talk about not only is good at the multiple roles that she occupies, but also manages to carve out her own new niche, Fillet. Now, before I start talking about her, I need to say that there's one and only one situation where I would never recommend building her, and that is if you have and like using a altar. Alright, with that out of the way, Fillet is a great operator, a new archetype where their entire kit centers around elemental effects. Fillet's talent reduces all elemental damage taken, and even has an interaction with Necrosis, where she gains 2 SP every time she's hit by an attack that deals it. Combine this talent with her S1, which cleanses all elemental damage buildup and gives her a shield that takes a massive amount of elemental damage, much like the shield that Aya Alter gives with her S2. People familiar with Aya Alter's S2 knows that this basically means that Fillet here will essentially almost never get inflicted with fallout, especially if it's necrosis. Admittedly, this is still pretty niche since it doesn't really mitigate any other type of damage, only increasing her HP by a marginal amount. It's insane when there's elemental damage, useless when there's not. But her S2 is just good in general. It essentially works identically to Thorns' S2, attacking whenever she's attacked with a short cooldown. This inflicts both arts and necrosis buildup. Another special interaction with necrosis in this skill where she doubles her own attack when she's inflicted with necrosis fallout, simultaneously doubling her arts damage and inflicted necrosis buildup. While S1 is great because it's amazing at what it does, albeit a bit niche, S2 is a great skill because, well, necrosis is busted. And aside from the damage that it deals, you'll be able to inflict necrosis to any enemy at least once in the skill duration, which not only is a free 12k damage, but also increasing her tankiness because necrosis reduces enemy attack. Overall, I welcome this new archetype. It was only a matter of time that we get some class with resistance to elemental damage, and Fillet is a great introduction to that. Next up is Catherine. Her bots give a shield. Now you may be asking, wait, Papyrus does the same thing and she's down one tier. But context here is important. First of all, Papyrus isn't even bad. Second of all, while Papyrus's shield was basically just a nice addition, I mean her shields are tiny. Shields are basically Catherine's entire identity. Starting with her S1, she gives a small attack and defense buff to all allies affected by her shields. Not a big one, and I do feel like the defense buff is wasted, because you don't really want to use it on people that would get hit, since there's a cooldown before the shield starts regenerating after getting hit. So to me, this is just a nice skill to have, for a permanent small boost. Good for ranged units and operators like Horn or Ashlock for example, but always worse than her grandson's S1. Catherine's S2 is where she starts to shine. It sends her shield generation to overdrive. Since her shields scale with her own HP, and she increases her HP with this skill, making her shields go up to almost a whopping 1,500 HP. For most melee characters, that's more than half their HP pool, and for ranged units, that's almost their entire HP pool. This essentially makes it so that almost any operator you place down will have at least 50% more HP as shields, while ranged characters essentially double their HP. Not to mention, this shield lifts the restricted regeneration the devices have and just regenerates 6% of Catherine's HP per second. That's almost 300 shield restoration per second, which, if you didn't know, is almost as much regeneration as Telopsis has with her skill active. The reason why I value this so much is because stacking shields this high is proactive gameplay rather than reactive. Let me give you an example as to what I mean by this. If you knew you were gonna take 2000 damage, would you rather take it and then subsequently heal it up? Or would you rather have a shield and just tank it? Like I said, you can think of the shields as extra HP that your medics don't have to heal, and regenerates by itself at a crazy rate, making any operator much tankier than they actually are, making Catherine such a solid operator. Finally, we get to Amiya's new form. This is most definitely Amiya's best form. Incantation medics have been so consistently good as a subclass, and Amiya definitely does not slouch. She has the most potent global healing in the game outside of Aya's S3. Her S1 is surprisingly really solid, sending her healing into overdrive while also getting a nice boost to her ASPD, boosting both her damage output and healing at the same time, while also just passively healing the entire screen and healing everyone in an area around her for a really long time. 50 seconds. It does have the searing SP cost of 70, but this is the type of skill that you would use at a crucial point of the stage rather than using it off cooldown, so that's mostly okay. Her second skill is also very good, immediately inflicting a movement speed and ASPD reduction to all enemies within range, getting an attack buff in the process, and now deals true damage. Aside from her global healing on skill, the true damage makes it so that, again, she heals an incredible amount. The skill actually occupies a similar role to S1, but in this case, when you're using the skill, you absolutely know you're gonna clear out the horde. I'm being serious. Even though the massive downside of only being able to use it once, I value it higher than even skills like Tequila's, because it's simultaneously a wave clearer and one of the best sustained skills in the game. Plus, she's Amiya. Come on, just build her. Bobbing. I really tried to justify putting this guy lower. You see, when I was pulling for Vinny Victoria, I got lucky and got her in 20 pulls. But this guy made me pull 40 more! And he didn't even come home! I hate him. But the more I see this guy in action, it becomes increasingly hard to deny that he's a good operator. You might be thinking, oh, but his range sucks. Actually a skill issue, just get good. But in all seriousness, Burn is just a really good status, immediately dealing heaps of elemental damage and inflicting a sizable arch shred. You might be thinking, oh, but Valarkvin deals necrosis really quickly, but she's not very good. Well, my good friend, that's because of her really awkward skill cycling. She activates necrosis in the first 7 seconds of her skill, inflicting necrosis really quickly, but then her skill is still up for another 13 seconds doing absolutely nothing. You basically have to wait for more than 40 seconds between each time you can inflict necrosis on the same enemy. Bobbing's skill, on the other hand, only lasts for 11 seconds, almost using his entire skill uptime to inflict burn. The enemy then gets burned and his skill ends shortly after. Since you can't re-inflict burn while it's still active, he's not wasting time recharging his skill while burn is still active. So he ends up only having around 14 seconds where he's not doing much. Not to mention that his skill hits every enemy in an area. Sure, it's a weird area, but again, skill issue. Overall, good uptime, burn is a great effect, and I hate his guts. The last operator in this tier is Underflow. Now, even though Underflow is the last operator I talk about in this category, I do think she's probably the one with least value among them. Some of you may even be surprised that she got in this tier in the first place, but let me defend her a bit. Yes, her S1 and talent aren't really anything to write home about, though her talent does become quite decent thanks to support from another operator I've yet to talk about, wink wink. Hell, even her S2 doesn't seem all that good when you first take a look at it, but surprisingly enough, the more I use her, the more I'm impressed. While her skill is active, she slows all enemies in the line in front of her with 100% uptime, dealing an okay amount of damage in the process. Like I said, it doesn't really seem that good, but that little bit helped me so much in so many cases. Having an AoE movement speed reduction from a melee unit, and one that has a 100% uptime on skill, is surprisingly amazing. I'm not even completely sure how to put it into words why I find her as good as she is. You just gotta try her out. Believe me, she's worth it. Okay, so far the operators that I've listed have ranged from operators that I would never recommend a casual player building to operators that are just incredibly solid that you can't go wrong with. But these top 3 operators are one that I would legitimately recommend anyone to build, as they will serve anyone that would build them incredibly well. Much like the other tiers, these next 3 operators are not ordered at all. To me, all of them give quite insane value. It's already difficult enough comparing operators that occupy completely different roles, balancing how well they do in their role and how much their role is needed. But as someone who only uses 5-star operators, these operators would be the cream of the crop. First up is someone highly anticipated, an operator most of you already knew was gonna top the list. The one, the only, Tin Man. To those not in the know, you might be slightly confused. Everything that Tin Man does seems really mediocre. He does a little bit of arts damage, he heals a little bit, he can weaken enemies a bit, and he buffs DOT damage? Well, first of all, Guy, his weekend has a 100% uptime thanks to his S1 cycling. When he has his S1 equipped, you can just think that enemies will deal 30% less damage. But his S2 is the one that I'd recommend building. 25% of his attack as healing is quite high, topping up any and all allies in range of his alchemy unit. And my guy, that is a big range. Not to mention the actual damage output of this thing. Sure, it may not seem that big, but by God does it put most AoE casters to shame. With how consistent this skill can be, the worst case scenario is it having a 10-second downtime if you're just haphazardly spamming it. And his DOT buff is really quite nice at a solid 22%. This will buff operators like Ascalon, Thorns, and Underflow quite nicely. And it even buffs the DOT from Necrosis. As long as it's DOT damage, he'll buff it. Not to mention his performance in IS-5, the game mode he comes with. His role compression of being a healer and arts DPS is amazing combination since you need operators to do multiple roles at once. Not to mention, his IS-specific talent makes it easier to traverse the mechanics of an IS-5, and you can recruit him in IS-5 for the low price of free. It's never a bad idea to take him, even over his 6-star counterpart Thorn's Altar, since the flexibility of him being 0 hope is amazing. Overall, Tin Man is a generous operator done right. He does damage, he heals, he buffs, all at just a moderate amount, but enough to land him as one of the best 5-star operators to come out this year. Fang Alter. In all honesty, if you were to twist my arm and ask who really is my favorite operator of the bunch here, I would most probably say Fang Alter. I have difficulty expressing how good this character really is. She's probably one of the most underrated operators in the game. Thanks to her talent, she's cheap as hell to deploy. Her S1 is essentially a bagpipe S2, and Fang's S2 increases her defense, more than doubles her attack, increases her block count, and now attacks enemies equal to block count. And once she's done with her skill, you can just retreat her and not only get a full refund, but also make the next operator cheaper. It's a really simple kit, but it works so well. She increases her attack by so much that it'd even take care of early elites. Whenever there's an early horde of enemies, I would say that she works even better than Bagpipe on occasion. There's really not much to say, she's simply just really amazing. She lets you trivialize certain openings, like in the recent So Long Adele rerun, EX7 and S-5 have really tough openings that Fang can absolutely carry. And once she's back up, literally just deploy her again for some extra DPS whenever she's needed. An incredibly flexible operator that has the damage to back up any squad that needs it. Now, some of you might already know who this last person in the list is. Some of you may be surprised that this operator got in with Tin Man and Fang Alt in the top spots. The last operator in this list is Rose Salt. An AoE medic with a pretty simple talent, slightly reducing her attack but increasing healing effectiveness. Her S1 isn't anything special, but her S2 has the same effect as Gavial Alter's S3, cutting all physical and arts damage in half. But I have to say that the mitigated damage will still be taken in the form of DOT over the course of 5 seconds. Now, you might have remembered me saying a while ago that healers need to do something other than healing to be useful. Rose Salt here does that in spades. Her talent boosting healing effectiveness in her range lets her off-skill healing per second rival that of Nightingale, which is nice, sure, but the draw here is that it is not selfish, meaning other medics would also benefit from this talent. Not only that, but self-heals from Solo Blades and Reapers will also benefit. Already off to a good start, but it's her S2 that really is the great part. There are many mechanics from bosses in Arknights that deal a significant amount of damage in a short burst. Even if operators still take the initially mitigated damage as DOT, that's much better than just straight up dying. Think of good old Herald here, quite the nightmare of a boss because of his screen-wide nukes on his HP gates. If you didn't have Nightingale to brute force him, you really had to micromanage the heat vents so that they are alive when you drag Herald to his next HP gate. Rose Salt's mitigation here lets you have an alternative to Nightingale, to just tank the damage. 50% mitigation is huge, it lets you defer the damage that you'll take. Not to mention, this also works on allies that can't be healed, like Solo Blades. And since this is a damage reduction rather than a stat boost, it also works wonderfully with operators that boosts defenses, or ones that reduce enemy attack. Now, I think this will probably be overkill most of the time, but the option is there. Scalter works wonders as she not only buffs defense but will cover for Rose Salt's HP drain. You can probably tell how much I value Rose Salt here. As I've mentioned with Catherine, Rose Salt is proactive gameplay, while also being reactive, much like with Nightingale. While I typically say mitigation is always better than healing, Rose Salt has both. So at least in my opinion, she lands herself shoulder to shoulder with the two juggernauts in her tier. Now, addressing the two new 5 stars that just got announced for CN, I'll talk about them briefly. I have neither the numbers nor the experience to talk about them extensively, but I'll put my thoughts as to where they'll land on this list. The Welfare Operator seems pretty decent for an Abjurer. I already think she's better than Tsukinogi and Nightcaller Deer at the very least. But even with good numbers, I don't think she'll match up with Quirkus or Silence Alter, since those two are just too good. But with good numbers, she could be an incredibly solid operator and might land her in the same tier as Catherine. On to the Agent Vanguard Surfer. Yep, she's busted. I think she's going to be at least as good as Cantabile. With good numbers, she might even be better. She'd definitely be on the same tier as Tin Man and the other two. Maybe even better than all of them depending on her numbers. She has the same S1 as Cantabile, which means that she's already good. And she has passive DP generation if there's no allies near her. Just insane. Not to mention her defense steal on S2. Defense steal on a pseudo-fast redeploy? Yup, they have to really give her bad numbers to make her drop it here. Ooh, okay, that's the end of the list. That was way longer than I thought it'd be. But hey, if you're still here, thanks for watching all the way through. And thank you so much for 4,000 subscribers. I'm a bit late on that part, but it is what it is. Honestly, my initial goal for this channel was to reach 1,000 subs by the time I hit the 1-year mark. And here I am with quadruple that amount, despite uploading as infrequently as I do. So, thank you so much. And thank you for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.